Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. On this special edition of Other Voices, we're going to take a hard look behind the headlines about the U.S. confrontation with Venezuela, a confrontation that seems to escalate every day. The U.S. is once again demanding regime change in a foreign country. Today, we're going to do our best to answer the obvious question, why? Helping us figure this out, yet again, on behalf of our country, we have two fine guests here. First, at the far end of the table, Charlie Hardy. Charlie, welcome to Other Voices.
Thank you.
Charlie is a former Maryknoll priest from Wyoming, who lived and worked with the poor of Venezuela for over 20 years, including 7 years in a tin and cardboard shack in the barrios. He lived for in a housing project in the barrios of Caracas. He's been an eyewitness to the social transformation of Venezuela into a participatory democracy, and his memoir about his years in Venezuela was recently published several years ago, called Cowboy in Caracas. And the cowboy part is because you're from Wyoming. And he's here visiting from Wyoming. How's the weather you left behind?
We didn't have as much rain as you've been having here. But,
yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. We have sun and warmth every day.
That's what I've heard. We're going to have to watch this guy. And my other guest sitting right beside me here is Lee Artz, who earned his PhD from the University of Iowa. Lee is a professor of media studies and the director of the Center for Global Studies at Purdue University Northwest. Lee has published 10 books on media practices, social change, and democratic communication. Lee has done research in Venezuela, worked with the Venezuelan consulate in Chicago, and written on community media and popular democracy in Latin America. And Lee, welcome to Other Voices.
Thanks, Paul.
And I will just add as a little addendum, Lee is, I should say, my immediate predecessor as director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, although back then it was Mid-Peninsula Peace Center.
Yes.
And that was 30 years ago, 29 years ago, when you took off to get your doctorate, and I stepped into the director's seat. So let's get started on something that's in the headlines today. Lots of stuff in the headlines to talk about. But I noticed on the New York Times website this morning, not their print edition, because today, Saturday, February 16th, a fleet of C-17 military cargo transports took off from the U.S. on their way to Colombia, carrying supposed humanitarian aid. And this is one of the things that's been, the newspapers and the administration has been making a lot of, is that Venezuela, Maduro won't let this humanitarian aid in. Let's start there and kind of unwrap that a little bit and what's really going on. Who wants to jump on that first?
Why don't you talk about
why don't you get started then?
The sanctions?
The first thing I would say when we look at U.S. media is I've always been skeptical of the coverage of the New York Times, ABC News, most of the mainstream press has of anything to do with U.S. foreign policy. I think in the case of Venezuela, it's egregious. It's almost beyond comprehension, the distortions that have been presented to the American public. So we're just confused about what's going on. I think there's a crisis. I don't think that it's a humanitarian crisis. And I think it's a crisis that's been created by the U.S. sanctions and by sabotage within Venezuela. If we talk about the humanitarian aid that the U.S. is proposing to deliver now, $20 million in humanitarian aid, but what the New York Times doesn't report is that U.S. sanctions deny Venezuela $30 million a day.
Per day.
Per day. So the idea that the U.S. is going to send $20 million in aid when they're denying Venezuela $30 million in trade They have made it impossible for Brazil to pay its electrical debt that they owe Venezuela. The United Kingdom is withholding $1.7 billion worth of gold deposits that belong to Venezuela. The United States has taken over the assets of Citgo, which is more than $7 billion that is owed to Venezuela. So the $20 million in supposed humanitarian aid just pales in comparison.
The $7 billion that belongs to Citgo, for example, is their money. It's but it just happens to be in U.S. banks, and now they can't get to it.
It'd be as if somebody said to you, Paul, we don't think you're a good person, and from now on, all of your bank accounts will be given to Charlie. And the bank can do that because you can't tell the bank what to do with your money, they decide, which is basically what the U.S. has done. It says, well, yeah, it may be owed to Venezuela, but we don't recognize Venezuela as a legitimate government or a legitimate nation. In total, Central America, Latin American Economic Center says more than $350 billion in trade has been denied to Venezuela since 2015. So we're talking in the last 4 or 5 years. $350 billion has been denied trade through the sanctions that go back to Obama, actually.
That's right.
And when you think about that, so any state would be a failed state. The United States would be a failed state if $350 billion was removed from the economy. So yeah, there's a crisis, but it's a crisis that's been created by the very people that say there's a crisis and we have to intervene to assist you.
A lot of points there of the things that don't show up in our reporting. Charlie, you got a comment on the humanitarian aid? Or?
Well, just for a moment about the media coverage. I was in Venezuela most of the month of December, all the month of January. And I got back a couple weeks ago, Saturday night. Sunday morning, I look on Yahoo News, and I see the headlines were from the Telegraph in the United Kingdom. Venezuela crisis, Nicolás Maduro on brink as military top brass turn against him. I thought, my God, what happened yesterday?
Right.
So I started reading the article, and there were like 47 paragraphs. Paragraph 17 said, one general says he doesn't recognize Maduro, a general who lives in the United States. But the headline was, military top brass turns against.
They just didn't tell you that brass was singular in that.
Yes, bracito or something, I don't know. But that's one of the things that we're really up against. And I don't care if it's public radio, public television, whatever, we're not getting the real story on what's happening. The whole thing of humanitarian crisis. I do not believe anyone in Venezuela is starving, no. Okay? It's tough, but nobody asks on all these programs. They can talk about the lack of medicine or the lack of food or whatever, but they never say why, what was mentioned by Lee.
Right.
Why is there a lack? And it's an example I use, roll of toilet paper, $1, and here it costs $1. But only had 1/4 the amount of toilet paper. So it's like $16 for 4 rolls of toilet paper. Who in the United States would pay for that? Do you think the Venezuelan government doesn't want people to have food, toilet paper, all these things? It's just to create an environment where the people think, Maduro is not doing a good job. But basically, he's been up against a lot of things. And I don't want to say that Maduro is a perfect president or not perfect president. I was in Venezuela at the time. I was one of 3 people invited to be at his inauguration. It doesn't say support or not support of Maduro. It's support for a process. He was democratically elected, and I don't think people understand the election process in Venezuela. It's Jimmy Carter some years ago said of the 90 countries the Carter Center had observed elections, the Venezuela election process is the finest in the world. There's a paper trail, every vote, so it can be checked, the computer results. It's uniform throughout the country and so on. our election process, I'm touching on this thing, they're saying Maduro was not legitimately elected.
Well, before we, I just want to
Yeah.
hit more on the humanitarian.
Go back to
We
that.
can come back to
We
the
do,
elections.
That's an
yeah.
important point,
But
is
you
the
started-
legitimacy of the elections. But yeah, let's stay on humanitarian.
Well, you started with the crisis and the humanitarian aid. I think that's important. The United States has, just last week, the United States blocked the importation of insulin to Venezuela. The United States interfered with dialysis equipment that was coming, with penicillin. If there really is an interest in humanitarian assistance, why is the United States blocking the shipments of such to Venezuela? That's the official policy of the United States. In fact, in the Miami Herald 2 days ago, they report that with the increased pressure from the United States sanctions, humanitarian crisis will be increased.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right in, like Charlie says, it's not in the headlines, but when you read the paper. The other thing we need to note is the Red Cross in Colombia said they will not support U.S. sending because they say it is not humanitarian aid. The United Nations says they will not recognize that as humanitarian aid because it has been politicized.
Politicized.
And if you keep going farther, the UN has not recognized Guaido, the OAS has not recognized Guaido. So when we talk about the press, you read the press. I'm not suggesting that they are telling us falsehoods, so in some cases there's evidence to show that. More importantly, they're selectively reporting. They're
it's
framing
what they're
it in
leaving out.
a particular way that makes it appear, and that's part of the goal, is that there is a failed 21st century socialism state. See, this is what happens when you have a socialist government. This all just collapses, and the United States has to intervene. But what's left is any context that there's a reason for this. $350 billion over 5 or 6 years, not allowing insulin, not allowing dialysis, not allowing shipments, not allowing the due payments to be paid. Of course there's going to be a crisis. Of course there's going to be a crisis. And in that context, present somebody like Guaido as a solution appears to anybody that reads it in the press, well, that makes sense. This makes sense.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Guaido for a second. Juan Guaido has now been recognized by the United States and several other Western governments as the legitimate president of Venezuela. I hope you could hear the air quotes in my inflection there. I understand that people in Venezuela kind of referred to Guaido as Viene de la Nada, the guy who came out of nowhere. What do we know about him, and how did he come to be recognized? He's only been in office for a little while.
And again, I don't know the pronunciation we use in Venezuela is Guaido.
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 Thank you.
And who is he? When I went to Venezuela in 1985, he was a year and a half old. And so he was eating baby food when I was looking at kids with bloated stomachs with parasites in them, okay? When he was 5 and a half, I was in a hospital morgue in Venezuela where I saw naked bodies of young kids just strewn on the floor because there was no place else to put them. When he was 6 and a half, I was sleeping with barrio people in the cemetery, 68 bodies in garbage bags. I mean, I'm saying all of that is before Hugo Chavez. This young punk, I'm going to say, knew nothing about the reality that, and don't think about me, think about the people who lived among whom I was living. That was their experience. Mm-hmm. And so there, 8 years, living in a cardboard shack, no running water, no sewers. Those people who lived there now have decent apartments, homes. Some have become nurses. Life has changed radically. But he has no knowledge of that. He became very much involved as a student in 2007 when Venezuela, the government, didn't renew a license of one television station, this millionaire who owned a television station. Instead, they turned it into a community. There's only a certain amount, as I understand, of space and the open air. They turned it into a community kind of station where independent producers were able to. But he went out shouting about lack of freedom of press. But he doesn't remember, I have newspapers from before Chavez, whole pages were empty. They were censored. In Venezuela right now, you can get Oh, Lord, you can buy a newspaper representing any view that you want. The fact that Guaido is running around on the streets now. I mean, what kind of dictator would the United States government have put up, for example, put this in U.S. terms. Imagine if in 2016, when President Trump was elected, if Nancy Pelosi had said, but Hillary Clinton got almost 3 million more votes then, I am going to declare myself president of the United States. And Nancy Pelosi declares herself president of the United States. And Russia and China and all these other countries come in and say, yes, yes, we recognize. That's basically what has happened. He's a young punk who has come out of nowhere. If you want to go back and talk about why don't they recognize Maduro's election, how did this guy, he was president of the National Assembly. He was appointed at the beginning of January. But the National Assembly, in Venezuela, there are 5 powers: the executive power, the legislative power, the Supreme Court, also the Electoral Commission, and also what's called the People's Power, which is the Attorney General, National Ombudsman, Defensor of the People, and so on. In 2015, there was elections, and the opposition won, but there was a problem. There were
One in the parliament.
yes, one in the
legislature.
parliament.
National
Okay,
Assembly, yeah.
but there were, and so they had the simple majority, 50+1. They also had the absolute majority, 2/3. But there were 3 people elected that it was clearly not a fair election. Okay, there was corruption, and so the Electoral Council said, you've got to hold those elections again. And the Supreme Court said, you've got to hold. But the National Assembly said, we won't do it. And so because of that, these other bodies do not recognize that National Assembly as a legitimate body. Okay. Now you can agree with that, not agree with it, but we agree. People might not agree with the decisions of our Supreme Court, but that's an internal matter there. And so the Congress has not been recognized because of that. In January, he was appointed president of the Congress, and he says, as such, there's a problem with the presidency of Nicolás Maduro, and so I am now president. He declared himself president of the country.
And he was appointed president of the Assembly, as I understand it, in that the opposition parties in the Assembly are rotating leadership, and it was simply his party's turn.
It was his party's turn, but he wasn't the choice of his own party. I mean, I think what Charlie's saying is yeah, he came out of nowhere, but he didn't come out of nowhere in terms of the U.S. He's been working with USAID. He went to George Washington University. His mentor was an executive director of the IMF. In 07, it's called Generation 07, which is an organization for transitional initiatives that the U.S. runs as precursors to regime change, where you basically train students to do protests. Guaido was part of this. And he's never been elected to office to speak. I mean, he was an alternate deputy from Vargas, which is one of the smallest states in Venezuela. In the last election, he got 26% of the vote. That's how he got into office. It was Popular Well's turn to assume the presidency.
That's the party.
That's the party. It's a right-wing party. They organized the guarimbas, the violent activities in 14 and 17, but it was their party's turn. The problem was Leopoldo Lopez, who was on the front page of Newsweek, was a darling of the U.S., has been found guilty of violence against civilians. The second person was charged with violence against civilians. He fled to Chile. They're running out of people. So Guaido is the one that assumes this, but he was never elected to that position. The National Assembly doesn't have an election to elect the president. It rotates through. And the party, Popular Well, it was their turn, and there was nobody there, so it's him. And the interesting thing to me is on January 22nd, on the 22nd, he gets a phone call from Mike Pence. On the 23rd, he declares himself interim president of Venezuela. And I would say, one of the reasons I would say the media is remiss, if you want, anybody that's even a cub reporter could get the Venezuelan Constitution and see what happens. Who is the successor? Like in the U.S., how do you end up with Nancy Pelosi president? A couple other people have to die or be removed, right? Well, how would he be? Well, if Maduro would abandon his post, which he hasn't, or was somehow incapacitated, which he isn't, the vice president becomes the president and has to call elections. Nowhere in that scenario does it work down here. But again, it's nothing that's reported in the press. He declared himself interim president because it is widely assumed that the election of Maduro is fraudulent or not accepted, which is what Charlie's saying. It's not. There were 60 countries that watched the election, right? The president of Spain, Zapatero, said it was one of the best elections he'd ever seen.
We're talking about the election last year in May of 2018.
When Maduro was elected. It's the same electoral
Re-elected.
process. It's the same electoral process, the same system that the opposition won the elections in the National Assembly. It's the same process where some of the opposition won mayoral seats last year and won Senate seats, regional governorships. The rule to me is the U.S. will recognize any election as long as the outcome is what it wants. There's nothing different about the Maduro election than the one that put Guaido in the National Assembly. It's the same system, it's the same process, the same people get to vote through the same, but they didn't like that one because they didn't like the outcome.
Historically, when the opposition wins, they accept the results. When they don't win, they don't accept the results. And one of the things with the election...
There's been great fraud and...
Yes. I mean, I remember so many times. There's been fraud. We will announce what we know tomorrow morning, and then tomorrow morning doesn't come, but you don't know which tomorrow morning. I mean, it might be tomorrow morning in 2025 when they will announce the...
And if you put this in some context, Aristide won the election in Haiti. The U.S. Marines go to Haiti, they put him on a plane,
right,
and they kidnap him and fly him to Africa, right? The Honduran president won the election. There was a coup. They put him on a plane and they flew him to Costa Rica, right? Mm-hmm. In Egypt, there was an election. Morsi was elected. There was a coup by the General Sisi, and the United States recognizes Egypt, Honduras, Haiti, or Saudi Arabia, which has never had an election and beheads people and is bombing Yemen, which is truly a humanitarian crisis. But if you were to put those in the New York Times and say, here's elections that the U.S. recognizes or doesn't recognize, and here's the rest that the U.S. does recognize, it becomes crystal clear. It's what Charlie's saying about the Venezuela opposition. The U.S. only recognizes elections that it agrees with the outcome. Otherwise, they're fraudulent. Otherwise, the person that's elected is somehow a dictator and needs to be replaced.
Just to fill in another point that is being left out of the mainstream reporting, I certainly haven't seen it when they talk about the claim that the 2018 elections were illegitimate. They neglect to mention that the opposition boycotted the elections.
Except for one that did run. Henry Falcone ran, but the U.S. sanctioned him for running. The United States government sanctioned Falcone because he didn't accept the boycott of the other opposition parties.
Yes, and so they decided not to run, not to participate, and they were going to participate. There was a meeting in the Dominican Republic, and they wanted to have the elections earlier and so on, and then...
They called for the elections, didn't they?
Yes, they wanted elections earlier, so they were held earlier, and then they didn't participate. And we as a country, I mean, what right do we... I was the candidate of the Democratic Party in Wyoming for the United States Senate in 2014, okay? My opponent had $3.5 million from oil companies, coal companies, pharmaceutical companies, and so on. We raised like $60,000 from individuals, $1 here, $5 there, and so on. Now, was that a fair election? I mean, really,
that's an
I'm the
interesting way to look at
Democratic
it, yeah.
candidate in part, Republican, but I mean, was that a fair election? And then we look at Venezuela, and these guys, these parties decide not to participate, and we say, well, because of that, it's not a fair election. It's double standard. We in the United States, we're the laughing stock of the world, really. When people say, how is it possible that the person who won the who got the most votes, lost the election? And yet we look around the world and criticize others.
Yeah. I want to drop back for just a sec, briefly. You mentioned Guaido as a student getting trained by USAID, Agency for International Development. I just want to touch on this because people looking at at the paper casually today are going to think, well, you know, this crisis is blowing up here, you know, in January and February of 2019. USAID was working with and recruiting student groups back in the early 2000s and pouring tons of money in and supplying the groups like that Guaido was participating in. You want to say anything about that?
Well, USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy has sent on average $10 million a year to opposition groups in Venezuela.
And that's been going on for years.
Right. And the United States is distressed because half a dozen bots from Russia were disrupting the last election. Can you imagine if there was $50 million sent to the United States to advocate for one particular political candidate or even one particular? It would be considered outrageous. This can't happen. Our national security is at stake. But the U.S. has no problem doing that, and that is largely financed. Political parties have even been formed in Venezuela because why not? Here's Uncle Sam going to give money. Charlie and I are going to form a new party. We've got a new party. They give us money. We set up an office, and as long as we're challenging Chavez or Maduro, we're going to be funded. No, then this is not something new. It goes all the way back to 2002, the coup against Chavez, almost immediately after his election, which the New York Times said, finally, Venezuela will return to democracy. That was their editorial, right? A coup against an elected government is a step towards democracy in the eyes of the New York Times or the eyes of the U.S. Government. I would say including the Democratic Party, because Pelosi, Biden, Bernie Sanders, all lined up with the military option is on the table.
For over
the
20
dictator
years,
must go, yes.
For over 20 years, the United States has been trying to overthrow the government, even going back even further, in 1998, when Chavez was possibly going to be a candidate. It's been going on and on and on. So what we see now is the result of 20 years of effort to get rid of the government.
And I would say it's particularly dangerous at this moment, because what you said about a man from nowhere, there was a poll in January that 80% of the Venezuelans don't know who Guaido is.
Yeah.
They don't know who he is. There is no organized opposition.
When he went out and did a rally on the streets in a very wealthy neighborhood of Caracas, by the way, it was the first time that most people in Venezuela had ever seen him.
Yeah.
I had been there most of December, and it was invited to be present for the inauguration of President Maduro. There were, I think, 3 people from the United States there in the Supreme Court building. And I heard him speaking of Guaido, and I'm saying, what is this Guaido? I mean, it was really the first that I had heard the name mentioned. Huh. It's incredible. One of my concerns, and I think Venezuela could become another Vietnam, a Latin American Vietnam. If just a couple seconds on this, why do I think that? Venezuela has one of the finest equipped military in the world, in my opinion. Venezuela had F-16 fighter planes from the United States, and this was during Chavez's time, but they couldn't get replacement parts for them. The United States would not let them have replacement parts. So they went to Brazil to buy new equipment, but they couldn't because there was some computer part or whatever from the United States. Then they went to Spain, but they couldn't get the parts.
Because of U.S. parts.
And so eventually they went to Russia. But I mean, they didn't go to Russia, they were pushed to Russia. Mm-hmm. And Russia has provided them with some of the finest equipment that they have given any countries in the world. And so they are very well equipped militarily. Secondly, the people are able to be very quickly armed and and ready to fight. So if the United States or whoever they have as a proxy starts to invade, I'm just fearful that a guerrilla warfare will break out and that people come from other countries of Latin America who are also upset about the whole thing. And this whole thing could turn into another Vietnam. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating, but that's why I am really, really afraid. And afraid being there is I'm in different places and I wonder what will this look like if it's bombed. And we see what has gone on throughout the world, whether it's Syria or whether it's Libya, whether it's Yemen.
I understand the illusion, but I would say it's going to, in my opinion, the danger is immediate because Guaido doesn't represent anybody. He doesn't even represent the opposition. Capriles, who ran in the election, said, we don't recognize him, we don't like this. The military is not...
Capriles being kind of one of the major
Yes,
opposition
he was part of the
figures
Democratic
previous-
Unity Movement, and he got, I don't know what percentage of the vote, you know, widely respected, reasonable as far as the opposition go, but he said this is not what we want. But it's what the U.S. wants, it's what the U.K. wants, it's what Canada, Brazil, Colombia, a few other countries want. The problem is you have to act now if you want this, because it becomes increasingly clear, day by day, as you said, Guaido has a rally, who's going to come to the rally? I mean, it gets further isolated. The idea that there's a humanitarian crisis gets further reduced. The opposition is not organized. There is not an internal opposition that would be required to actually have the kind of thing they even had in 2002. That's gone. So the U.S. has to act almost immediately if they want to take advantage of their creation of this humanitarian crisis with this interim president. And my fear is not Vietnam, because they have 350,000 soldiers. The military, the only military that was not trained in the School of the Americas, which is one reason it's not going to be bought off like all the others. You have militias, 50,000 militias, right? People that are armed. The U.S. isn't going to send troops. Colombia is not. They will bomb. They will bomb like Iraq. Remember shock and awe?
Yeah.
That's what will happen. That's what will happen. And the press won't tell us, because just like we didn't see any dead bodies in Iraq, or like Madeleine Albright after 500,000 kids were starved. She said it was worth the price. Yeah. Abrams testified just recently to Congress where he said, yeah, the Mazotes massacre in Guatemala was, yeah, it was worth it because they got democracy. But once you define democracy as whoever you want is in office like General Sisi, then anything prior to that is justified. And if the media agrees not to cover the atrocities, you bomb. You bomb. This is not some idle speculation. This is where we are right now. And the interesting thing is they have to act now because world opinion is not in favor of them. The San Francisco Labor Council just passed a resolution against U.S. intervention. The Canadian National Labor Council passed a resolution against that. In Haiti, they've had demonstrations for 7 days in a row against their government, in part because they have violated the agreement with Petrocarib with Venezuela. More than 100 countries do not recognize Guaido. The OAS does not recognize Guaido. The UN does not recognize Guaido. You have to go now. And that's why this is so urgent now, I think, for all of us to say, U.S., hands off Venezuela. Now, it's not an idle thing. It's like...
How likely do you think this is? It's always hard to
We do not
try to guess the future with the guy we have in the White House.
It could be any day. Talking to my son who's down there, he said, if this happens, you will have utter chaos. Yeah. If that's the objective of the United States, that's what will happen. Try to divide the country. Guaido doesn't have the support of, there's many people who would like to be president of Venezuela. He's not on top on the list. One person whose name I would add to the list of people who would like to be president of Venezuela would be Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, I really believe that the milk he got from his mother's breast, I don't know if it had vitamin D, but I think it had HC, hate Castro, hate Cubans that have stayed there. And it's really, and it is an attempt to get at Cuba. And I heard him on public radio saying that if we can get to Venezuela, then we're going to be able to get to Cuba. Let me give you one neat quotation, though. December 7, 2016, President-elect Donald Trump said in Fayetteville, North Carolina, this quotation, "We will stop racing to topple foreign regimes that we know nothing about. This destructive cycle of interventions and chaos must finally come to an end." Isn't that a beautiful statement?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what happened. He probably doesn't remember he said that. But he's been encircled by people who see things totally differently. And it is trying to promote
me, the danger
chaos.
is much larger than that, though. I don't speak the Voldemort name. I don't think that it's particularly impressive. To me, the most interesting thing is that Biden and Pelosi have lined up with U.S. policy in Venezuela that says, yes, it's an illegitimate government. Yes, a military option is on the table. The thing for me that we often forget is Obama was president when Venezuela was declared an extraordinary threat to the world and the sanctions
And the
began.
first sanctions
and
were
the last
imposed.
thing Obama did when he left office was establish a global center for counterterrorism that gives the Trump administration authority to conduct covert ops. Obama signs that on his way out of office after he knew who had won. He signs that. So this is not something that we can lay at the feet of Bolton or Abrams or Trump. Of course you can. But it's also at the feet of the Democratic Party, top to bottom.
It's another
I mean,
foreign-
even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has not made a statement. Why haven't you made a statement? There's no question here. There's no two sides. Venezuelan people, with all the gains that have happened over the last 20 years, free education, free health care, 3 million homes have been built, indigenous rights, and your other two, we're going to listen to this? No, there's no option here. There's not like, let's negotiate. It may be one thing for the Maduro to say we want a dialogue like Mexico and Uruguay and the UN has advocated, but for the American people to say, well, there's two. No, there's one. U.S. hands off Venezuela. That's the only thing. Anything beyond that is confusion or naivete. That's the option in my mind. It's U.S. hands off Venezuela, no sanctions, no war.
All right, I want to get to the audience, but I need to bring up one of the raps against Maduro is there have been protests of the economic situation, and the charge has been made is that he has verged on repression, if not engaged in political repression, in putting down these demonstrations. What's your response to people who say that?
I saw a statement by the World Council of Churches in which they said, stop imprisoning peaceful demonstrators. Well, people throwing Molotov cocktails, are they peaceful demonstrators? That you don't see. I presume there are people, who have been taken. The size of the demonstrations, by the way, maybe 100,000, maybe a few 100,000 people marching in opposition. That was also true back against Chavez. And difference now is the military is not supporting these people marching. And it's kind of a celebration for wealthy people, too. Not just wealthy people, there's others, but to get out and march in demonstrations. But they do not show you here in the country the number of people who are marching in support of the government. It's very lopsided. And so let's say you have a few 100,000, but there's millions of people who live in Caracas. And if anything happens, this will not stop. They're planning the 23rd of February, another march. When Chavez was overthrown and then back in power, he was overthrown on the 11th of April, back in power on the 13th of April. So he's back in power. On the 11th of May, there were opposition demonstrations. 11th of June, it went all the way to December. Then they had the strike on the petroleum industry and so on down the line. So don't be overwhelmed when you see lots of people marching. But what dictatorship would put up with this number of people? So are there people in opposition? Well, yes, there are people in opposition. Are there people from the barrio in opposition? Sure, there are people in the barrio in opposition. But the title of Cowboy in Caracas was a North American's Memoir of Venezuela's Democratic Revolution. The title I wanted was Venezuela, the World's Best Kept Secret of Democracy. But if you publish it, the editor, the company gets to choose a title. But I really think that's the situation. There is an incredible sense of democracy in Venezuela. And if Chavez used to talk about socialism for the 21st century, he was talking about searching for a new way. But just using that word became a threat. But I would say it's oil, by the way. That's a big factor involved here. 1500 BC, the Aryan people went into India, and they didn't have a word for war. Their word for war was the desire for cattle. And I think maybe 100 years from now, people will find in dictionaries, instead of the word war, the desire for oil. And I think that has a lot to do with what's involved. Venezuela has more oil reserves than any country in the whole world. They have
Untapped
gold.
reserves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gold. Coltan, I understand, is something used
natural
for
gas.
cell phones and so on. And so there's lots of money involved here.
And I would say, I think oil's a primary economic motivation, but I think in terms of U.S. policy, it's also, we used to talk about Nicaragua when I was at the Peace Center here, was a threat of a good example.
Yeah.
And Venezuela is another threat of a good example. When you build 13 universities, provide free college education, 2 million more people are going to college, and they're not from the white wealthy areas, they're from the barrios. That's not something that you would like to have in the United States. Could you imagine free public education in the United States? How can a little country like Venezuela afford to do that?
How can we afford to do that is what we...
Free health clinics, right? Clinics in every neighborhood. Again, that's a threat of a bad example.
Yeah.
The U.S. says it's not practical. The Democrats say it's not pragmatic to have Medicare for all. We can't do it. Well, what if they're doing it in Venezuela? What if they have free education, free health care, built 3 million housing units in the last 4 years during the sanctions? But in the U.S., we have homeless people in the street. It's a threat of a good example. So yes, it's oil, but it's also, what do you do with that oil? You use the wealth of that oil for the benefit of the population, not for Exxon or not for the candidate that gets the money to run for office. It actually gets used for the population. That's a big threat.
This was
And
almost...
also, I just want to stick in it, and I do want to get over to the studio audience. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions, and I'm running behind. On the question of oil, it's not that the U.S. needs this oil. We've got plenty of oil, and thanks to fracking, we've got more than the planet can afford. But I think the Russian presence in Venezuela, and Russia is another major energy supplier on the planet, that it's as much a competition against Russian and Chinese influence in Venezuela related to the oil and who controls the oil and the price of oil. But people have to understand it's not just to take barrels of oil, it's who controls the spigot and what happens with the proceeds.
And I would say they don't even care if a country nationalizes the oil. Like they say, well, Guaido says, well, when I'm president or if I'm president, the oil will be given back to Exxon, basically, and that's what Bolton and Abrams both say will be better for everybody. But they don't have a problem with Saudi having the Saudi prince controlling
Yes.
the oil, because it's not being used for the population. It's still being used by Halliburton and Exxon and the rest. So it's not even that.
It's no
But
threat
you're
to
right,
the capitalist oil.
Right.
Yeah. Let's get to the audience. Steffi will come around with the microphone. Okay, one here. I thought I'd see 20 hands go up. And if you would stand up and make it a little easier on our camera people.
Thank you very much for being here and for this amazing discussion. I only wish every ear in this country could hear this discussion right now. I think something that a lot of people are digging up facts and figures about is the economic warfare that has been waged for over a decade against Venezuela in terms of foreign exchange currency manipulation and the banking system and how that has played a role in actually derailing some of the economy. The sanctions are newer, but actually controlling what the banks and lending situation has been in the past affects also other countries like China, like Russia, who might be coming in through an economic war angle. I know Jordy here has done a lot of work on that front, and I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Thank you. Either of you want to take that?
Charlie?
Please, I would rather hear if you said someone has done a lot of work on that.
Hand them the mic, if you would.
Yeah, there's a book that I learned about on democracy now, and it's by a Venezuelan professor in Caracas who's an economist, who describes in detail how the economic war is being waged and the economic details of how it's done, and then uses statistics to show that it actually is an economic war. It's not an economic crisis that has been brought on by the government. For example, for inflation, there are certain economic variables that inflation depends on. That depends on the amount of foreign exchange and or bolivars in foreign banks and the liquidity in Venezuela. But the inflation in Venezuela doesn't have any correlation to normal economic variables. And it's apparently being set by the black market in Venezuela. And the black market arises because of induced shortages, which also don't have any relation to the normal economic variables.
What is the title of the book and the author?
The Visible Hand of the Market, Economic
author?
Warfare in Venezuela.
Do you remember the author?
Pascalina? I'll find it for you.
I can maybe give you an example of something, though, that you might be able to relate to. So this is over the course of 10 days. I bought an ice cream cone at McDonald's for 480 bolivares. It's the only thing, I mean, everything else would be too expensive. But within a matter of a few days, it went up to 960, and then it went up to 1,500.
Yeah.
Now, why would, I mean, I'm going to say, how is McDonald's involved in this whole thing? Why are their restaurants still open when nobody's there? They're waiting for something. And maybe along that same line, I could take you to a grocery store in Caracas where there are empty shelves all over the place. I can also take you to another grocery store where you can get anything you want at all, okay? Now, I didn't have enough time to ask or look, but I remember when there was rioting back in 1989 and people broke into the stores, their storage rooms were full of food, but they were just waiting for the prices to skyrocket, and then they would be down. I don't understand the economic situation. Maybe you can comment more on that, but all I know is the reality of the place.
WikiLeaks had a recently, I think in the last week, they released documents. It's called the Army Special Operation Forces Unconventional Warfare Booklet, and you can read through it, and it describes the policy of the Pentagon, which is not just military war, but it's economic war. And you could think about it, I guess you don't see them so much in Palo Alto, but where I come from, on every corner there's payday loans. You can go in and they will loan you money for your paycheck, and it's really affordable. It's only 25%, right? I mean, and they'll loan you another one. So if you can't pay it back by that Friday, they will loan you more, but the rate has to go up because you're a bigger risk. You can imagine, it happens with everybody individually with their credit card. The same thing would happen for a country. It's not like you're sitting around with billions of dollars. It's usually run on credit, and it's usually run on an agreement between the banking system, whether that's the IMF or the World Bank. And this happens with not just Venezuela, but almost any country. If a country's doing something that is not desired by the IMF or the US, suddenly their ability to get credit or loans, it disappears. So where do you go to get credit or loans? Somewhere else where it costs you more. Italy right now, the money they owe to their debt is 105% of their GDP. So they can't pay it back. Venezuela's caught in that same spot. And it's sabotage, it's hoarding, it's smuggling. If you have subsidized milk or subsidized water and you can get this for, 25 cents, and I buy up everything in the store and I drive into Colombia and I can sell it for $1, I'm going to buy up the entire store. And there hasn't been any regulation on this. I mean, if you want to criticize the Maduro government, is their failure to regulate foreign trade, failure to regulate the subsidies for basic foodstuffs, because people speculate in it. And so in addition to things are in the warehouse and it goes to the elite grocery stores, things are in the warehouse, it's not going to the barrio. Things that are subsidized will go to the barrio, but anybody can buy it all, put it in a pickup truck and make a fortune going across. So it's a concerted effort. So it's not like this crisis just kind of came out of nowhere. In fact, if 21st century socialism actually was, they would nationalize the banking system, control foreign trade, stop speculation, regulate the economy, identify what people need, and produce for that. They haven't done it. 70% of the economy is capitalist. 70%. The private media, 75% of the audience is private media. Yes, they have 1,200 community media stations, kind of like this,
Yeah.
which is an amazing thing. But there has not been any move to change the basic market system, which is completely haywire, for a reason, because it's orchestrated by payday loan people out of the U.S. State Department.
If they had nationalized the banks, they'd have been in big trouble with the United States.
No, absolutely. No, and I understand this, because if you, I mean, look at what happened in Cuba when Standard Oil said, we're not going to refine your oil, and Castro says, well, that's okay, we'll do it ourselves. You have the Bay of Pigs, you have an economic blockade, you have, right? They're ready to go to nuclear war over that. So yeah, I would not want to criticize Chavez or Maduro for not doing, what needs to be done may be something that they can't do because the actual physical military threat of the, well, in this case, Colombia, Brazil, US, Canada, UK, right? So yeah, this is what you would do to regulate the economy and meet people's needs, but we can't because of the US and the UK and other countries.
Let's go back to our audience. If you stand up, please.
You've described very well what the United States is doing, but other countries in Western Europe, which do have free medical care, which do have free education, and a lot of social benefits, similar to what Venezuela has achieved, why are they going, supporting the overthrow of the present government?
Fair question.
You're right, they do have, but they don't, the governments that currently exist don't want that. Look at Macron in France. There has been demonstrations for 114 straight days. I think that's 14 weeks, however many, by the Yellow Vests. And a week ago, the CGT, the largest union in France, joined them in national demonstrations because Macron wants to take back many of those things, including public education, including welfare, including health care. He wants to privatize that. That's his purpose. He's bumping up against the French people. So if Venezuela is able to do this, and he tells the French people that we can't, again, it's a threat of a good example. Italy, what has Italy got by following that austerity program that the IMF and the EU have? They're on the verge of collapse. Greece was held hostage. So yeah, the governments might, but the population doesn't. I would suggest if Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party were Prime Minister in the UK would not have its current position. We need to separate the government, just like we do with us. I always get nervous when somebody says, we're in Iraq, or we're in, no, we aren't. They are. They do not represent me. Obama, Trump, Democrats, Republicans do not represent me. The 500,000 kids that were starved to death in Iraq that had the support of the British government and the French government and the German government, not the population. Just like we don't have a connection or control over the governments, they don't in Europe either. The threat in Venezuela is they actually do. The Constituent Assembly that in the New York Times appear as if it's a Socialist Party, United Socialist Party of Venezuela, like the minions getting together. No, the Constituent Assembly is a popular election. They had more than 600 candidates for that office. That Constituent Assembly replaces the National Assembly, and it overrides Maduro. It overrides Maduro. What the Constituent Assembly proposes that will come out will be put to a popular vote. That becomes what they do. They call it participatory democracy. It's written in the Constitution. When they give out bags of rice, you can say that they have the articles of the Constitution on the bags of rice, on the egg carton. They passed out little tiny constitutions to everybody. Why? Because they wrote it. It's their constitution. It's not Maduro's. It's not Chavez. So yes, I would say you're right about the governments in Europe and the US, but to me that's revealing. Those are not democratically representative governments, which is why they're at odds with their population often.
So let me check with our YouTube monitor here. Do we have any questions online, or?
It's a comment. demilitarization and an end to oil wars should be included in the Green New Deal, just like it is central to the Green Party Green New Deal. And then a comment, same person, thank you, Lee, for the hint with the yellow vests. And besides, unlike Venezuela, France doesn't have any oil.
Okay. Are there any more questions right here in the front row? And if you would stand up, please. Hold that right up there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, especially since they have this participatory democracy, am I holding it close
Yeah.
enough? Why there isn't some recourse to out Guaido? I mean, how, within the system that they have.
You want to speak to that?
Talking to my son, he was saying, I mean, Guaido is moving freely. And in the United States, if someone would do that, that person would be arrested right away, I think. Something similar happened after Chavez was overthrown. A group of generals would appear every day, every night in Plaza Altamira. And why didn't the government go in and arrest them as they got up and spoke? And basically, they just let him tucker out. Now, on the one hand, if they were to arrest him, then there would be more scandal throughout the world. My son said, big deal. All the newspapers are in opposition already. Why not, do that? That could be done, but for some reason, the government has decided just let him run and do whatever for the moment. I don't understand the reasoning, but if there's an invasion, you're going to see a bloodbath. You're going to see a bloodbath. And
Let me, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to interrupt because we are almost out of time, and I want you each to take 30 seconds. What do we need to go home with for what we're going to do and keep in mind in that?
The last question is one of the reasons I say it's so urgent that we publicly demonstrate against U.S. intervention, whether it's sanctions or more, because there is a process of referendum. In fact, the second person in the National Assembly has called for new elections. And if you had you can have a referendum, which they did once with Chavez, and he won. But you could have a referendum. You could actually call new elections. And what happens with somebody that only got 26% of the vote isn't elected, and also it's no longer his turn to be the head of the assembly. In other words, the U.S. has this timeline, which may be getting shorter and shorter, where they have to act, which is why I think it's so urgent. I don't think it's a given the U.S. is going to intervene, but I do think we have to say, U.S. hands off Venezuela.
Hands off Venezuela. We're going to have to leave it right there. My guests have been Charlie Hardy, who lived in Venezuela for over 20 years, and Lee Artz, professor of communications at University of Purdue. Thank you both for joining us. You've been watching the special edition of Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Thanks for joining us. Lee?
Thank you.
Charlie, thank you.